Well, my name's Amy Kilgard. I'm a professor at San Francisco State, and I teach performance studies and communication studies. And we have with us Christine Benvenuto. Could you just say a short thing about yourself?
Yeah, I'm a psychotherapist, and I've worked in mental health for about 20 years. I started the Oakland DBT and Mindfulness Center, which is a center that does group and individual therapy for people with very complex emotional issues.
And David Pepper.
Hi, I'm a doc. I'm with UCSF. I also teach with them. I practice family medicine and work for Contra Costa County, and with an interest in death and dying. Disclosure, Christine's my wife.
Yeah. And we're going to ask a couple of questions that we may respond to, and then open it up for you all to ask questions and talk about some things that you may have seen in the show. So first, for the folks who work a lot around mental health and wellness, what are some of the ways that you've seen catastrophic loss and some of the things that Stephen presented in the show affect people that you've worked with?
Well, I think one thing, Stephen, that you conveyed really accurately, which is such a common thing, it's like that hopeless state of just like, fuck you. That's just like the desperation of there's the loss that's like the permanent loss, somebody dies, but often what I see is the sort of loss that happens with its like a loss of a relationship, or the loss of somebody to alcoholism, a loss of someone to psychosis, a loss of someone to depression, and that's actually, that's in some ways a more difficult loss because the person's still there, but there's a loss of what would have been and how they could have been in relationship with each other, and where there's a different sort of acceptance that you have to work with. The person's no longer here, and that helplessness that you portrayed is, I think, very common experience. Helplessness, anger, despair, and withdrawal.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Do you have other experiences thinking about that, kind of the loss of how folks deal with that loss?
Yeah, I mean, powerfully done, alcoholism and loss are common threads. And maybe I flip it around as sort of Stephen did at the end, and that we all do our own cooking, and maybe sometimes the most powerful medicine is that ability to see ourselves eating chicken, even if it's condom soup. And that's maybe the eternal optimist in me, and that even having worked with a number of 1,100 patients who I followed for a long time. And there is that despair, but then there's the times that people get through for whatever it is. And so I think that despair is a state that does afflict a lot of people. And maybe my own choice is also to remember, as I thought you did a beautiful job of rounding out the call to Janet, that those touching moments that we hope to have. So I don't know if it's a direct answer, but there's my own coping skill.
Yeah, how have you seen people practice that kind of resilience and find those kinds of hopeful moments and ways to go on?
Yeah, I think it's like what people choose to add to what happened, right? There's that, it's like the narrative of there's the thing that's happened, and then there's what you add to the narrative of what it means. And one can, I think from that place of despair, there's all of the catastrophic meanings, and then from the place of when enough time passes and people come to at least a place of being able to be with that difficult experience, then there's more of a place of choice of what sort of meaning am I gonna, like, what am I gonna do with this? Like, how am I gonna make gold out of this thing, because I still have the rest of my life in front of me.
Yeah. And, when you think about AA and the models of AA, we really start from your end. People up here that kind of fall down, and people get down and they sort of bounce down into the low spot. When we talk about recovery and sobriety, you always hope that somebody can come from here and come back up. And sometimes, obviously, they don't, and we have to let go of those people. And to say the survivors sometimes, but there's always having that hope. People having seen pretty desperate situations where the guy who's a serious meth addict on the street, and he got a call that he had a son. Turned out some girlfriend from 25 years ago that kept the baby, and he didn't even know it. It was transformative. Had a reason to live. We never know when those calls will come.
Well, one of the things for me is making art. So making performance and making art is one way that I've seen lots of folks kind of try to navigate through really difficult experiences. And one of the questions that I think, Stephen, is probably central to a lot of folks in thinking about how you created this from a pretty difficult situation perhaps as a form of resilience. You also did that in a way that maybe feels a little jarring. There's a lot of language that in other contexts might be considered problematic, racist, sexist, homophobic. So what were your choices in doing that as one of the ways you built this show?
I think my general goal in using this kind of in-your-face content is to give folks in the audience a visceral feel for some of the people in real life that these characters in Tastes Like Chicken represent. In particular, the prosperity preacher and the Southern preacher. Obviously, not all Southern preachers or all Southern people are such bigots and horrible people, but it's generally my general aim is to give folks a visceral feel for how violent, ugly, and callous these worldviews and the type of rhetoric that is put out there by these people in real life. And for me as an artist, performer, when I use this kind of provocative content and language, I'm obviously stepping on a little bit of a tightrope. And when do I slip into, you said, problematic territory? For me, generally, it's two questions that I have to ask myself. One, have I addressed my own racism, internalized racism, homophobia, sexism, and patriarchy, which I would argue 99% of Americans have, just because that it's ubiquitous. It's the soup that we swim in and that we've grown up in. So I would argue, to some extent, we have all those oppressions carried in us. Obviously, some more than others. And so the question is, have I examined those oppressions during the course of producing, developing a script, and in particular, Tastes Like Chicken? The second question is this content in the script for cheap laughs, for adolescent humor? And so if I get a very strong feedback from the audience that the answer is yes to both those questions, then I need to go back and to the script and rework things.
Are there other things that you all thought of as you were watching that you thought, oh, that's a really interesting turn in terms of emotions or in terms of thinking about loss and feeling? this was the first time you'd seen this show,
Yeah.
right? Are there moments that kind of stick out in that way? And you mentioned the phone call. I think that phone call is especially...
the flip, because there's a fair amount of darkness and depression and again, maybe I've watched too much Hollywood and I like the happy ending. But, and then you hadn't sort of kept going. You had, another kind of twist, which is nice. And those are the use of theater to both connect people to things they might not connect with, but ultimately, as you're saying, inside things that are inside us, loss and pain, but then hopefully through that to life, because we're still alive and we're still looking for that call from our dad or the televangelist will have a stroke or whatever it may be. Christine?
I was maybe in agreement with, appreciative of, angered by the conversations with God. Mm-hmm. And just this kind of, my experience of kind of this cultural deficit around spirituality that, we're talking about loss, and there's, so much of, when people are like at the end of life or in these real crisis situations, it's like, turn to God, turn to prayer. That's so much of what's, as humans, we're meant to have access to provide meaning. And then I thought you did such a lovely job of portraying, much of, and it's like, oh God, that's the way that God is like shoved down people's throat. That's the access that people get. And it was very, it aroused a little bit of anger for me, disappointment that-that's what is, in some parts of this country, a norm.
Yeah. But, the other twist that to sort of play on that is we know that from the medicine community is one of the most important things for health, probably far more important than antidepressants or even exercise, just having connection with theater, of course, provides some of that. You didn't specifically lay it out, but in a way the televangelist, his best friend is the new chief guy who's the black guy who's just insulted and he wants to do coke with and drink with and go get some sacks, all very empty and vacant, and the alcoholic knows his buddy down this, who lives in the van around the corner, and he's talking to Jesus without a phone, kind of a little more connected, and that wasn't, I'm reading that, but I thought those were interesting pieces.
What about from you? Questions? Yeah.
So my question, actually, for you and for you two who deal with people in serious emotional trouble, is I was amazed at the Jesus is playing Xbox. He says, "What makes you think I care about you?"
Yeah.
Click, and then it turns around from there. His dad calls him. And to some extent, one of the ways I think traditional religion is sort of shoved down our throats is, oh, Jesus will save you. And, that can be comforting to some people, but it can also be a sort of a self-pity thing or a thing that takes people just wait for it instead of, oh, I'm going to have to figure it out myself, and maybe that's liberating, or maybe something comes in from left field, like the Father calling. I kind of wondered what your reaction to that is.
I just, there's the joke, Jesus saves, but Moses invests. The money play a little bit on that. I think you're right. You hit on a point that that is true, and Jesus and Christine spoke to a little bit.
When I do intakes with people, when I first meet them, it's just always interesting to hear what their spiritual lens is like when they're coming in for services. And, I would love to, like if there's, the different versions of despair that go with different sorts of relationships with God, or lack of relationship with God, or sort of like a bought relationship with God, or a more personal relationship with God. I don't know that I have an answer on that, but I'm very curious about how like a personal relationship with something bigger than oneself, how that affects somebody's sense of well-being versus kind of like that bought relationship where you're kind of hoping for the best at the end, but it's maybe more of a fear-driven relationship rather than something that is like an ongoing meaning-making conversation.
It's like more empowering as opposed to fear.
Yeah.
You have any thoughts about that? Right now?
Not right now.
Okay.
Later, come back to me.
Other questions that you have about the show, or things you're thinking about?
I just had a comment back about yours, which is, I'm Jewish, Christine's not. And in Judaism, it's a very one-to-one view to God. Especially in the Orthodox, there's no middle person. The rabbi may know more Hebrew or something, but there's no raising of anybody. And Catholic Church is much more, through this person to the bishop, to this, to the cardinal, to the pope. You have to sort of go through, oftentimes with money and sort of. And I don't, you know more about Buddhism than me. But I just raise, are there more depressed Christians and Jews, or are there more? Getting at your point, which is interesting, about does your relationship to spirituality and ultimately to God reflect how you deal with depression, which is something that I heard.
It's like it's like what do people go to for soothing when they're in really desperate times. And I don't know that I have an answer for that, but I wonder what the kind of that fundamentalist language is so fear driven that I don't know how soothing that is in a moment of despair.
I think as humans, I think somebody said, we're all, kind of hardwired for these range of emotions. So in our own way, individually, we've all had our lowest low and our periods of most elation, and so that whole concept of that inner narrator, plays such an important role, because what we pay attention to, we get more of, and how we soothe with how we self-identify as how we're feeling, and so if like the alcoholic trying to make things better by more alcohol, and those problems tend to get worse, and maybe they bottom out, or maybe they find a trap door in their bottom and keep going down, and then and if they and this is kind of my question. So if you have that kind of real trauma earlier in life, and oh my God, you think of the caravan coming up and what some of those young children are going through, does that in the future help them to identify with, like, what might be really traumatic for me is like, we're still right in there, and it doesn't feel like the lowest low, and they've been there before, and they don't have, because what will really bother some people, other people it just kind of brushes off, and I don't know what causes why people can adjust better, and is it because they've had worse trauma, or is it that they can just stay in the here and now and not listen to the narrator? Because for most people, if they can stay in the moment, if they're breathing, things probably aren't so bad as the story they can tell.
Well, a big indicator, too, is community. And, as you're talking about the caravan coming, it's like talk about, coming out of really intense circumstances. And what I found myself wondering is, this community that's being developed. They're coming north. And is it, I can imagine it being a community of hope and a community of resilience and a community of story sharing. And one of the indicators of where something becomes a traumatic, something goes to trauma versus something's just I went through something really hard, is there's a relational aspect of it. One of the things that has something turns into trauma is there's no opportunity for communication about what happened, so it sort of just stays lodged as some traumatic memory that somebody's dealing with on their own, versus in a relational way where it can be sort of metabolized and understood, and you cry about it and somebody gets it, and that whole process. So what's happening in that caravan? I'm kind of curious, are these shared stories of the worst things that have happened, but in that group they're able to process and make meaning, and who knows, it could be a caravan of hope by the time they come up here to some extent. The caravans of despairs are the ones where there's no where people are sort of left alone in secrecy and then shame around personal experience.
The two things I think of are neglect is far worse than abuse for children. So if you take a child and you feed them, and at least you're showing some attention, which is what you know. But of course, ACE, adverse child events, it's a big Gabor Mate stuff. It's a big indicator of how resilient people are, is how many adverse child events. And it's things we might, divorce, moves, but obviously bigger abuse, neglect. Not to say that abuse is good, but there are a lot of indicators that adverse child events, particularly early on, are very detrimental to resiliency and the ability to move through. Christine took your point, I think, very nicely around the caravan. You think about Moses in the caravan leaving everything behind. Or there's other kind of caravans in history. Mao Zedong, when he left, they ended up creating incredible power. So at least that answers your question.
Sort of related to what you were saying is one thing that was on my mind, Stephen, is your father is an Asian man. It's sort of the last person to ever seek the mental health services for Asian men, and you brought up your father a lot, and I just felt that isolation and that, he was at home, and what you're talking about, community, and I don't know, get away, but it's just that feeling of unable to reach out and seek help, and I don't know if that's true or not, but if he felt like he just couldn't try all the avenues to feel better, whether that's medication or counseling or family.
Right.
Yeah. It just is something in my mind.
Within my own family, there's definitely a very explicit instructions not to talk about my father to anyone, and even people within our own family, outside of the immediate circle. Now to go back a bit, so all this was triggered because of predatory mortgage lending, and my father, he was piling up hundreds of thousands of dollars in debt. He's having get personal loans to pay off the mortgage, and so he was starting to have anxiety attacks and stuff. So he actually went to at the time he went to Kaiser, and so part of this is kind of is an indictment of Kaiser, because they made things much worse, when he really fell into his, we call it a major depressive disorder, but it doesn't quite capture the level of depression, but that's the official diagnosis. When he really went into it, he had no motivation to leave the house, much less go seek treatment. So, but yeah.
Well, it's a big issue because I know, like, it's a big dilemma, right?
Yeah.
Other people, what kind of help? Or in that position.
Isolated older men are dangerous for suicide.
Mm-hmm.
Isolated
Yeah.
older white and Asian men.
Yeah,
Are
I
at
mean,
risk.
my dad he's Filipino, and he just told me his friend said that her husband is doing the same, is staying at home and doesn't want to go out and is in nerve.
Yeah.
She said, can you go and talk to him? I don't know what, he's probably not going to listen to me. But anyway, I'm just acknowledging that that's, part of the picture is that you could solve, right? But you had to watch.
Yeah, I mean, going back to Christine's point about powerlessness, it was definitely an exercise in swimming in powerlessness, because no matter, me and I have two other siblings, we spent uncalculated hours talking to this expert, that expert, medication up the wazoo, a lot of energy spent with the expectation. If you dig deep enough, you'll at least get like X. We'll get X, even if it's tiny, we'll get X. No, we had to watch while my father, even through our best efforts, continued to sink to his depression, and that was an exercise in powerlessness. And that was probably I would say, for me, the most painful part of the experience, when we were in the sort of the crisis mode, to watch a loved one decline, and you can't do anything about it. There's nothing you can do about it. At least not in our case.
Right. It's, to change from X to K. I don't know if anybody's read Michael Pollan's new book, How to Change Your Mind, but ketamine is being experimented and particularly for very deep drug-resistant, multi-drug resistant depression, much like ECT, which might have been something, I don't know if they went there, which is controversial itself, but instead of...
They wanted to.
Yeah, well, right, instead of zapping yourself with 2,000 volts, why not try a chemical that lasts 30 minutes? But as you say, like with addiction, my brother's 3.5 years sober, but in and out of the ICU, and just about died a few times. My father, 87 and okay, but still had to deal with it. And the most painful thing is to watch the house. And but anyway, I don't know if ketamine, but if people haven't heard of it, and if you're dealing with it, it's an interesting twist, and the literature is interesting.
I think we need to transition to a closure, but I think that one of the things that we can end with is the once again being grateful to be in community with other people, thinking about and supporting one another as we're going through our losses, and thanking Stephen again for making a piece of work that allows us to think about these things in a community with other people.
Yeah.